Good afternoon and welcome to the webinar. My name is Dan Evans. I'm the founding chair of XSPI, which is a cross-sector development partnerships initiative. XSPI is a nonprofit volunteer initiative created to promote collaboration between Australia's 5 key sectors contributing to Asia-Pacific international development and SDG achievement. These comprise government, NGOs, not-for-profits, business, philanthropy and private capital, and lastly, academia, health, medical research. Although XSPI has a defined regional reach of 19 countries, our current priority is to support the start or expansion of cross-sector development projects in PNG, Indonesia, and Bangladesh, representing Melanesia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia regions. XSPI itself doesn't manage or fund projects. To open this webinar, I want to acknowledge country by paying our respects to the Wurundjeri owners of this land and their elders past, present, and emerging. Today is the first of a planned 3-part bi-monthly series whose purpose is to explore future international development business models. This is widely recognized as very critical, as many organizations are already exploring alternatives given traditional funding models are stagnating or declining. Also, new actors are emerging. The series will explore the critical challenge that to really achieve the SDGs, there's a quintessential need to think and act differently. Part of that challenge is the future of business models, including cross-sector partnerships. Today, we explore the current status of international development. Our webinar is supported by Accenture's pro bono research recently completed in collaboration with XSPI in a project titled Sustainable NGO Business Models and the Role of Cross-Sector Partnerships. Alex Schmidt, Accenture Development Partnerships Australia and New Zealand lead, will discuss the research and formally launch the report. Webinar 2, tentatively planned about 13th to the 15th of September, will build on today's themes by exploring where international development practitioners see business models going in the next 10 years. Webinar 3, tentatively planned for about 21st to 22nd November, will be a deeper dive into current, emergent, and promising models which might successfully achieve the required changes. It's very satisfying that this series is an XSPI collaboration with ACFID, Accenture, AIDN, and New Zealand's Council for International Development, CID. Each of these 4 entities have important XSPI roles. ACFID, AIDN, and CID all serve on the XSPI Advisory Council. Accenture's Alex Schmidt and Tori Stuckey, key in both the research project and planning this webinar among XSPI's 44-member-strong expert network. Today's moderator, Steve Goudswaard, belongs to both XSPI's expert network and our PNG working group. Steve worked in international aid for over 28 years in global, regional, and national management roles. His roles have covered both humanitarian and development contexts. He now uses that to run his own consultancy called Navigating the Uncertain, which supports leaders and systems through change and disruption. Today's 3-part program starts with Steve's fireside chat on the case for change with Paul Ronalds, who's very well known. Steve will then hand off to Alex Schmidt to provide an overview of the Accenture research being launched today. And lastly, Steve will then moderate the panel on the experience of NGOs on the ground and where to next. To optimize our time today, we refer you to yesterday's email from Accenture for speakers and panelists' brief bios. I acknowledge with gratitude that today's participants have agreed to have the webinar recorded for distribution. During the webinar, we ask for questions or any comments to be posted on the chat box. We definitely plan to finish at 1:30. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Dan. And let me add my welcome to everybody. Good to see you all here today. Welcome particularly, Paul. Thank you for making time today. As many of us know, Paul is the former director of Save the Children Australia, and he's just moved into his new role of head of global ventures at Save the Children International. So to kick us off, Paul, I'd be appreciative if you could just give us an overview of the business model approach that you've taken over the last 9 years at Save the Children Australia.
Thanks, Steve. And perhaps also just as an introduction, a huge thank you to you and to Dan, the team at Accenture and at ACFID. I mean, this is a really timely webinar series, and it's fantastic that you've coordinated all of this. And thanks for having me. In terms of the work that we've done at Save the Children Australia while I was CEO, we've really explored a range of different, what I would say, financing models. So broadly speaking, the term is innovative finance. We've piloted a range of different business models. So these include establishing a range of social enterprises. This includes the Centre for Evidence and Implementation, for example, which does a fair bit of work in the sector. We have been involved in results-based finance work, more in our domestic work than our international work, but we've certainly been exploring that. We set up an impact investment fund, so Australia's first impact investment fund run by a charity. And we've been looking to leverage a range of other funding mechanisms like climate finance and loan mechanisms and those sorts of things. So, Steve, it's a very broad range of innovative finance and new business models. I would say, though, that in all of that, what we've been, I think, pretty focused on is how do we move the dial significantly on, say, the children's mission, so that the means for achieving that mission have changed, but that the focus on the mission in some ways has had to become more focused.
No, I appreciate that. I guess could you elaborate a bit more on the rationale for delving so intently into the new models relative to what Dan referred to as declining traditional funding models and the requirements of SDGs?
Yeah, so I mean, another is the necessity of all invention. Certainly when I started at Save the Children Australia, I think within about 6 months, Tony Abbott was elected and proceeded to significantly reduce Australia's overseas development assistance. So the sort of formal ODA started a fairly significant decline. And that was in the context, of course, of a declining private market. I think most people on this webinar would know that really since the Asian tsunami, overall giving by Australians to aid and development causes has been declining. So both the private and on the public side, our funding models were under significant strain. On the other side of the agenda, we've seen an extraordinary increase in demand for the sorts of activities that the sector leads on. So even before the impact of COVID and the more recent conflicts, and of course the ongoing impact of climate change, the 3 big C's, we had a $2.5 trillion annual funding gap to achieve the SDGs. So we've got some very specific issues here in Australia with a declining market, but it's in the context of that broader significant increase in demand. And so, you know, from my perspective, we've got to do really 3 things to address that. 1, we've got to find significant new sources of funding. 2, we've got to find different sources of funding. So if we're going to really drive innovation at scale, we've got to move away from the sort of short-term, project-specific, site-specific funding that is the sort of hallmark of the sector, and find much more patient forms of capital that can really help us scale the innovation that we need to do. And then the third piece is around the types of interventions. Most of you are no doubt watching this webinar on a computer that, you know, 10 years ago was 1/100th as powerful and cost probably 3 times as much. We haven't seen that sort of improvement in value for money in our sector. And I think we need to ask ourselves why that's the case. So we also need to generate, you know, in the context of that declining overall funding, the increasing need, what are the interventions that allow us to achieve our missions at a far lower per unit price?
So how do you go about doing that? Like what do you need to bring into an organization to make, first of all, that sort of innovative shift away from traditional funding mechanisms, and then the driver of what you're talking about to drive down the cost per unit?
So I think all of us need to be asking ourselves sort of three key questions, and I'd be encouraging all of the exec teams to be asking their boards or engaging with their boards on this question, and for boards to be asking their executive teams these questions. So one, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? Be really clear. And again, I've outlined some of that with the increasing demand, the declining forms of funding, and each of the organisations on this webinar will have a different financial model. They might be more private orientated. Within that, there might be segments. You've got to understand your existing context and be really clear about the problems you're trying to solve, but also be clear about what are the opportunities. And while, you know, it's easy to be pessimistic, on the other side of the ledger, there's some pretty exciting opportunities for organisations if we're willing to go after it. So from my perspective, I mean, I see some huge funding opportunities that are not traditionally the ways that we look to fund our work. So blended finance is about $9 billion per annum of funding. Very few NGOs, at least in the sector, engage much with the development finance institutions, the DFIs. Most large bilateral and multilateral donors have a DFI or a DFI division. And of course, impact investing. So depending on how you define impact investing, it's somewhere between about 500 billion and $1.5 trillion of available funding. So there are a range of these big funding pools if we can tap into them. Second thing is that there are a range of new technologies that help us really address that value for money, and they're expanding exponentially. Just last year, there was $20 billion of new investment going into EdTech. There was about $50 billion of new investments going into health technologies. You know, and then there's fintech, and there's a whole raft of others as well. So these technology areas are expanding rapidly. There's a significant amounts of investments, but most of that investment is in high income contexts. And so again, I think the challenge for us as a sector is to say, well, how do we make sure that some of that investment and some of these new technologies are suited to the sorts of contexts where we operate and are going to be helping to address the digital divide, not actually exacerbating the digital divide. So being really clear with your boards about what the opportunity is. And then the third question, Steve, is, well, how do you execute? How do you take advantage of this? And I think, again, that's where we need to spend the most of the time. I think, you know, most people will be generally across the problem. They'll generally be across the opportunities. It's the execution on that is the really, really hard piece. The structural challenges in our industry are huge, and we can perhaps talk a little bit about that. The capabilities that you need to really execute on these opportunities are quite different from the traditional capabilities that are in our sector. We need to think about our risk appetite. I mean, we need to be really frank with ourselves. We operate in a highly risk-averse, compliance-orientated sector. All of our staff have been taught and drummed into them is to be compliance-orientated and risk-averse. And then we suddenly want to turn around and say, now we want you to be entrepreneurial and agile, etc. When we need to understand the cultural change that needs to happen. And then, Steve, the final thing is we need a lot of patience. When I started, I think about 6 months after I started, one of our senior staff wrote me a memorandum at Save the Children Australia about this Green Climate Fund opportunity. So that was 8.5 years ago. Save the Children Australia has now just received approval for the first $50 million funding through the GCF. The registration process, or the accreditation process for GCF, took itself 5 years. But from a global perspective, Save the Children Australia now has a pipeline of about $350 million US for GCF, and it's the second largest pipeline in the Save the Children movement. So huge patience, but it's paid off in the end.
I mean, you've alluded to innovation or resistance and things like that. What did you need to do to address sort of inherent resistance and sluggishness within your own organisation? And how did you amplify the new skills that you're referring to?
So The first thing is the burning platform. There's got to be really clear about what's the motivation. No one likes change. Change is difficult. Why should we be engaged in this change process, particularly one that's likely to be quite difficult and long term? And you've got to do that at every level in the organisation. So when I joined Save the Children Australia, we had that sort of external circumstances that I mentioned earlier on. That provided a really strong burning platform, but there was a lot more to it than that. I mean, talking about the sector, the fact that the aid and development sector is generally ill-equipped, in my view, to function effectively in the 21st century. Our main funding mechanism are these time-bound, site-specific, one-off funding mechanisms. They're just not suited, really, to the sort of significant scale change that we're looking for here. So really emphasising that with boards, with my executive team, and with the broader organisation. On the other side, Steve, also really clear to say that the whole reason for Save the Children wasn't changing. So our mission, if anything, needed to be even sharper. We had 3 global breakthroughs, and everything we were going to do was going to be even more focused around that. So again, people could feel, right, the reason that I joined up to become part of Save the Children is not changing. So my intrinsic motivation, I'm still comfortable with, but I understand that I need to be thinking about these alternative ways of achieving that. Now, in an organisation like Save the Children, you can't sort of go from one to the other. You don't wake up and come into the office on Monday and it's all new. So for us, we talked about this concept of Engine 1 and Engine 2. We needed to do a continuous improvement on our Engine 1. So this is the quality of the way that we were delivering existing either DFAT or multilateral funding programs, the continuous improvement in our private fundraising, increased focus on philanthropy, all of those sorts of things, Engine 1. But we were going to make sure that we found funding and we gave significant attention to Engine 2. So Engine 2 are these innovative finance mechanisms. These are these new technologies. Now, the trouble is that most of the time, you're under a lot of pressure to focus on a sort of, critical issue on Engine 1. And by the time you get across to Engine 2, you're not giving it the sort of attention that you need to really get the traction. And that's the exact opposite of what's required, because Engine 2 is where you're going to need to do all that cultural change. It's where you're going to need to reset how people see you. You're going to need to recruit all of the sorts of new skills and capabilities that you're going to need to be able to execute effectively. So you've got to focus on all of those sorts of things as well. Yeah, that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah, but I can imagine that you need to stop doing some things, particularly around Engine 1. How do you make those trade-off decisions when Engine 1 is still your lifeblood and Engine 2 is nascent? What kinds of things did you find yourself saying no to that was core business or something like that? If you can give us an example.
Yeah, so Steve, this is a classic challenge. It's a classic challenge for any organisation, not just in our sector. We've seen lots of organisations from Kodak to Blockbuster fail miserably to be able to move enough focus from Engine 1 to Engine 2. For Save the Children Australia, it was particularly difficult because we're in a difficult financial position given the context, and we had to actually cut a lot deeper than what we would otherwise do to make sure that we had sufficient funding for Engine 2 while still wanting to do that continuous improvement. So we did some pretty significant process improvement across our Engine 1 business. We have a sort of global movement, global implementation capability. We had to do some pretty hard work in Australia to cut some of our current staff and rely more on the global delivery mechanism and make sure that they were going to perform the way that our donors needed them to perform. So that was a sort of difficult transformation process, not just for Australia, but for how we interacted with the broader Save the Children movement. And then there were a range of other activities, from fundraising activities, and essentially we gave up on community fundraising. For example, a really resource intensive area, but one where the payoff in our view was too low, and we moved that much more heavily, for example, across to digital fundraising.
I mean, you're really talking about new skills here, like portfolio management, sort of trade-off, return on investment, things like that. Where do you go to find that kind of skill level in the NGO world?
Yeah, so I mean, it certainly does exist. I mean, what if you're limiting yourself to the NGO world? You've got to go and look for some of that skills in perhaps some of the more entrepreneurial startup environments, perhaps organisations that are your non-traditional actors and that might have approached you to actually see if they could partner with you. The question becomes, well, yes, a partnership might be terrific, but actually you've got a sort of entrepreneurial zeal, you've got a culture and a range of other things. Can we bring you into the organisation? And certainly, you know, Save the Children Australia did a little bit of that with, for example, Library for All, where, you know, they were a digital library, much more of a startup mentality. They're already sort of digital natives, if you like. Bringing that was another way of infusing the broader Save the Children culture with some of the sorts of skill sets that we wanted. But the reality is you're going to have to go outside of the sector as well and find people that are clearly sympathetic to the mission and empathetic to the way that you operate, but bring some of those non-traditional skills. And I've certainly found plenty of those sorts of people. The good news is that they do exist in the private sector, and many of them are very disillusioned there and are looking for the opportunity to come and work in a really mission-aligned organisation like Save the Children. So we've been able to recruit some extraordinary talent and bring them in, and they've been able to take us to the new level. Now that is tricky because not all people from the private sector succeed in our sector. You know, we've got diffuse governance structures, we've got much more difficult goals in the private sector, we've got different financial models, but many of those skills are transferable, and with people with the right motivation and passions, they can be extraordinarily helpful.
Yeah. So what about you as leader? What did you need to develop? What kind of mindset or skill set did you find yourself having to develop through this process to allow for, you know, real investment in future returns which were not proven versus the consistency of the present models?
Yeah, so I mean, perhaps one of my struggles as a leader is sometimes I can run a little bit far in front of my team. I have needed to really make sure that I've doubled down on the communication piece, both with my board and with the executive team that I put in place, to make sure that people were constantly understanding the direction that we were making. So that was certainly something for me as an individual. But I think the more important thing, Steve, was to think about the balance of my senior team. To execute on this, you need to, you know, if you're going to effectively do continuous improvement in Engine 1 and provide sufficient focus on Engine 2, you need a senior team that has the capability and the trust and all of those sorts of things to be able to do that together. So, you know, no secrets. I recruited a team when I joined as CEO, about half of which were from the private sector, half had significant sector experience, but all of them were dedicated to this need to really rejuvenate the aid and development sector, to try new business models, et cetera, et cetera. And so while they weren't all engaged in that process, many of them were absolutely focused on our Engine 1, which freed me up to be more Engine 2 focused. We had a very clear shared vision for where we wanted Save the Children to be in the coming years.
I mean, you could say that Save the Children is a large international organisation that has the space for this kind of innovation. What would you say to smaller organisations who are on the call that would like to go in this way, but perhaps don't have the resources?
Yeah, so I mean, there's no doubt that Save is large, and there are some opportunities that are probably more open to Save the Children than others. But again, I think that's just a problem to be solved. I mean, when we set up our impact fund, I spoke to a lot of other NGOs in the sector about partnering with us on that, and I really was keen for it to be a sector asset, if you like, or sector capacity building opportunity. actually no one took up that opportunity. A few of them, I think, discussed it with their boards and they couldn't get it across the line. We are looking to partner with at least one smaller NGO, aid and development NGO, as part of our Fund 2, which we're looking to kick off early next year. So there are certainly partnering opportunities. That's one. I think, though, that in some senses, the smaller organisations can be more entrepreneurial, more agile, if they've got the right sorts of capabilities and capacities, and in fact don't have some of the same challenges that a more established NGO like Save the Children, certainly a larger one with a larger existing portfolio, might face. So in that case, yes, there are additional challenges, but there might be also some additional opportunities. Key things are still the same. Is your board really energised? Do they understand the burning platform? Have you recruited a team and skills that have that? Now, that won't be overnight, particularly in a small organisation. You can't just go out and buy that. But as you're rejuvenating your team as a CEO, continue to think about what are those next generation skills that you need, and then looking for those smaller opportunities, the partnership opportunities, to start to execute on these new business models.
Yeah, I mean, what do you attribute that to? You've been doing this for 9 years and had very little first followers from within the industry. Are you delusional or are you a visionary?
There's a really funny YouTube clip about the guy on the lawn that's dancing alone. Yeah. Will people follow him or not?
Yeah, leave your clothes on, mate.
That's right. Look, I don't think that's what's going on here in our sector. I think we've just got to really understand the structural changes, the structural challenges that face the aid and development sector. And look, if you haven't read, there's a great new Unlock Aid report that I think is one of the best articulation of those structural challenges. It really focuses on highlighting these problems, for a sector that doesn't incentivize results, where funders tend to emphasize compliance, where we're essentially dominated by a project mindset. I've mentioned the sort of main funding model, which are these time-bound, site-specific one-off projects. I mean, all of these are significant structural challenges that need to be overcome, and it's not easy. So, I mean, I think it's not surprising that the sector as a whole has been fairly slow to really start to pick up on these. But, I mean, I think you've just got to be persistent. It goes back to that point, Steve. You've got to be really patient and determined.
Yeah, good. Paul, thanks so much. We could probably continue talking, but let me hand it back to Alex to outline the research, and then we'll pick up some of this in the panel conversation afterwards. I appreciate your time, Paul, and thanks very much. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thanks, Paul, for the extremely valuable and insightful discussion. And thanks to you all on the call for joining today. As Dan mentioned, I'm Alex Schmidt, and I lead our Accenture Development Partnerships practice for Australia and New Zealand. So today I wanted to talk to you about some of the themes and findings from the recent piece of work that we conducted with XSPI, the Cross-Sector Development Partnerships Initiative, on sustainable NGO business models and the role or potential role of cross-sector partnerships. So firstly, to touch on the research methodology, it comprised of a series of deep dive interviews with a cross-section of Australian-based international and regional NGOs to discuss their organization's experience with cross-sector partnerships and business model sustainability. We also conducted an environmental scan of close to 100 different sources, which was primarily academic literature, to extract some of those key insights and themes, and also compare that to what we were hearing from leaders in the industry. So today my talk will cover the burning platform, which Paul has very nicely referred to just now, for the NGO sector and the need for transformation. I'll also talk about the role of cross-sector partnerships in creating business model sustainability and impact, some of the benefits and barriers to cross-sector partnerships, and finally, what it takes to transform and some of the keys to success, which I think Paul has also alluded to several of them very well just now. So it's good to see some synergies there. So firstly, for the burning platform. So traditional funding sources for NGOs, such as government grants and philanthropic donations, particularly in the international development sector, are becoming less reliable and less sustainable. We see an over-reliance of many NGOs on just one or two significant income sources for a substantial portion of their revenue, which can often range between from 20 to 65% of total revenue. At the same time, the problem NGOs are being asked to solve are becoming increasingly more demanding. The convergence of issues such as deepening poverty and inequality, forced displacement, and the increasing effects of climate change mean that the challenges NGOs are being asked to solve are arguably more complex than ever before. In parallel, evidence is emerging that relevant functions from government and public authorities have been transferred have largely been transferred to the not-for-profit sector, even further increasing this burden on NGOs over the last 20 years. We know that the funding landscape is also changing in a number of ways. Donors are donating differently. Digital technologies are impacting how organizations do business and where our audiences are, something that we certainly see a lot of at Accenture Development Partnerships. And this is often hard for NGOs to keep up with. While new blended forms of finance are becoming increasingly more common alongside the rise of impact investing and social enterprise style business models. So it was great to hear Steve and Paul talking about some of that as well. So in terms of the rise of social enterprise business models, recent data from Social Traders estimated that there are over 20,000 social enterprises in Australia, generating up to 3% of our GDP and employing around 300,000 Australians. So this also creates difficulty for NGOs to continue remaining relevant in the impact that they create. So our research suggests that three potential avenues exist for NGOs facing such pressures. So the first option is to transform and embrace new fit-for-purpose business models and make them part of your DNA. The second option, consider merger or acquisition with an NGO with shared objectives. Can we combine forces? And the third option is to slowly decline until a point where we may need to unfortunately cease operations. So business as usual is no longer an option. Now to touch on the role of cross-sector partnerships. The challenges of today are too big for any one organization to solve alone. Holistic, system-wide approaches need to be taken in order to achieve meaningful progress and improvements, which would be difficult without the use of cross-sector partnerships. Our research suggested that there is indeed a viable role for cross-sector partnerships to contribute to both business model sustainability and amplification of impact. Several benefits of cross-sector partnerships emerged in the research, particularly in relation to partnerships between NGOs and the private sector beyond pure cash-based relationships. So firstly, one of those benefits, cross-sector partnerships can create both cost savings and efficiencies through the sharing of infrastructure and administrative expenses. Secondly, they can enable the technical and human capital from other sectors that NGOs need and are often difficult skill sets to recruit for, while at the same time enabling knowledge, skills, and expertise transfer. For companies in the private sector, cross-sector partnerships can really contribute to strengthening their environmental social governance, ESG, portfolio or mitigating ESG risk, and higher social acceptance or license to operate. Finally, harnessing skills and assets across multiple organizations can create more impact than relationships based on the transfer of cash or financial resources alone. Together, there is a potential to deliver greater impact towards the sustainable development goals than either organization would be able to do by themselves. Now, coming to some of the barriers of cross-sector partnerships, what is holding us back? If there is value in cross-sector partnerships, why are we not seeing more examples in international development out of Australia and New Zealand? So some of the barriers that we uncovered in our research included an imbalance in power relationships, where relationships can be controlling and asymmetrical, which put the success of partnerships at risk. The values alignment, There can be a sense in the NGO sector that working with commercial organizations who may have differences in values can make it difficult to align those interests without compromise. The comfort zone, which I think Paul spoke to really well. We know that system-wide progress to complex social problems is often tackled in isolation in the development sector, with various NGOs contributing to independent solutions, and the culture that is around that way of working. Cross-sector partnerships really require partners to step out of their comfort zone and embrace collaboration and do things differently. The final two barriers that we uncovered were financial and procedural. So on financial barriers, the barrier to entry can be high. Cross-sector partnerships can often be dependent on some kind of underlying philanthropic donation before they get to the point where they can sustain themselves and start to create impact. And finally, procedural, particularly smaller NGOs with less resources may find that the administrative requirements challenging to commit time and resources to. So finally, to talk about what it takes to transform and some of those keys to success. So I've talked about the burning platform, some of the potential roles of cross-sector partnerships in business model sustainability and impact, and some of the benefits and barriers. Now to touch on what some of those success factors are. So we found in our research that organizations that demonstrate certain characteristics are better positioned to adapt to these changing conditions and transform to new business models. So the first characteristic was an aligned and shared sense of purpose, which cascades down from leadership across the organization and allows the organization to move with more agility and deal with that change that Paul spoke about. The second is the ability to manipulate resource configuration. So this includes the ability to draw in outside capability across partners, suppliers, and adjacent organizations, and repurpose internal resources for new business areas. Finally, one of the final characteristics was a strategic direction towards alliances and partnerships to enable the access and sharing of resources. The risks and capabilities can significantly alleviate the challenges created by the current burning platform that we're seeing in the sector. So in terms of the final recommendations from our report, which I would invite all of you to dive into after the closure of this webinar, the 5 keys to success. Make sure you have the right leadership. So to succeed, leaders need to have a culture and mindset to fail fast and take risks and not fall back on traditional means of donor aid and siloed development work. Secondly, make it part of your strategy. Identify what cannot be compromised on, but recognize that partners will likely need to make some level of compromise in order to reach a common goal. Third, transparency. Ensure that any partner relationships or discussions are transparent from the start and communicated effectively. The more collaborators perceive their self-interest as linked, the greater the potential for co-creating value. The fourth key to success and recommendation, compatibility. Look for common strengths and compatible organizations that fit from the perspective of both values and capabilities. The more both partners can integrate their resources conjointly and mobilize distinctive competencies, the greater the potential for value creation. This also enables costs to be shared and reduced by coordinating as opposed to duplicating efforts. And finally, get started. True business model innovation in the NGO sector is not common, and successful cross-sector partnerships are even more rare. This suggests that many of us are not willing to take the risk, even when the alternative facing us may be even more bleak. I want to end with a quote from Nobel Peace Prize winner Muhammad Yunus in his 2010 book about building social business. Yunus said, "Now is the time for bold and creative thinking, and we need to move fast because the world is changing fast." I think that statement becomes truer every day and is certainly more true now than it was when Yunus wrote his book back in 2010. So my final message is, will our sector rise up to the challenge and embrace new ways to increase our impact and our sustainability? Or will we remain in our comfort zone and risk a gradual decline? I hope that you will read our report with XSPI and that you find it valuable, which will be made available after this session, and start thinking about how you can bring new ways of thinking into your organization, including cross-sector partnerships. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Alex. Appreciate that. There's a lot of good stuff in there. Funds are down, complexity is up, and the challenge continues for all of us. So let me bring in the panel. So I'm Shane Nichols, the CEO of Good Return, Michelle Higelin, Executive Director of ActionAid, Aidan Wyatt, the Acting Assistant Secretary for Global Partnerships and Programs at DFAT, and Paul and Alex, who have already spoken. So as people start to respond in the chat box, please send in your questions or your comments as well as we go through this. But let me start with Shane and say, what's your response to what you've heard from Alex, from Paul, or your own thought from a point of difference?
Thanks, Steve. I'd be happy to share some of our experiences from our work at Good Return and some observations on some of the points raised. So at Good Return, in addition to grants, donations and government contracts like all NGOs, we also raise investment capital, and we've been doing this since 2009. Initially, that was focused on the public, so it was raising debt to fund microloans through overseas partners. But more recently, we've been raising funds through our impact investment fund from institutional and sophisticated investors. And that blended capital approach works very well for us as an agency, because our work is to make finance more inclusive for marginalised and excluded people. And this requires obviously access to finance for those people, so the financial element, but also the skills needed to be able to make good use of that access to finance in terms of financial literacy and small business skills. So for us, we're a DGR and DFAT accredited agency, that that traditional aid model, and that's really good for financing our training and development activities. But on the financing piece, we need to look to other ways to raise money, and so we also hold a financial services license that enables us to raise those investments. And so that blended capital approach works really well for our business model. In terms of partnership and how we work in the field, we partner primarily with private sector agencies, social enterprises, if you like, and we provide them with that mix of financing and technical assistance. And so that partnering approach for us in terms of leverage is quite significant. By partnering with fairly large development finance institutions in country, we're able to achieve outsized impact. If we can change their processes to make them more gender inclusive, to make their services available to people with disabilities or people from ethnic minorities, then often that just requires a nudge from us, a financial nudge, and also training and technical support. But if they can deploy those changes across their portfolio of hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of clients, then we as a fairly small sized agency can achieve outsized impact. So that partnering approach is quite important. On the investment side, we have a mix of the investors, so not the grant makers, but the actual investors in our work are a mix of foundations, corporates, high net worth individuals. And it is a different relationship to pure philanthropy. Their motivations are still social impact, but you really need to engage the head through a clearly articulated business case, as well as the heart. And in some ways that can be harder than raising donations. And so, that's something that I think agencies need to consider if they want to position themselves for those sorts of financing, is how you're going to communicate that to funders. And I think the funding environment here in Australia still has a long way to go to get its head around these alternate forms of development financing. And then just a comment, I guess, in that I believe the international development sector is becoming increasingly fragmented. And I'll give some examples. In April this year, I attended the Impact Investment Summit, which was held in Sydney. The focus was on the Sustainable Development Goals. The mandate was global, a lot of agencies there working across Asia and the Pacific. Very few Australian international development NGOs present in that conversation. And then last month, I attended the Asia Venture Philanthropy Network meeting in Indonesia, over 1,100 people, range of agencies looking at different ways of working, collaborating. Again, very few Australian NGOs present there. Coming up in September, we've got the Social Enterprise World Forum in Brisbane. I'll be really interested to see, what sort of presence we get from Australian NGOs there. And all of these fora contained dozens of agencies working in our space, addressing social and environmental issues across the region. And so I think Australian NGOs really need to start engaging with, in these different fora with a range of different agencies. Because the future, I think, will be characterised by a wider range of actors operating in this space, different sources of funding, particularly as, I guess some of the geostrategic shifts in the world order occur. And also, as I think Paul mentioned, just the pace of change in technology. I mean, I'll be fascinated to see what does it mean to be a social activist in the metaverse. There's a whole new world evolving, and how are we going to stay relevant in that space? And look, frankly, it doesn't matter to the world if we don't, because others will fill that void. And so, the question is it going to be us or someone else? And it will probably be a combination of the two. And then further to what Paul and Alex mentioned, I do agree that mergers and acquisitions are one approach, to addressing some of these strategic shifts in the environment. But I also believe that nimble, specialised agencies that are really good at working in cross-sector collaborations have tremendous opportunities ahead of us and can really add some significant value to the sector.
Yeah, thanks, Shane. I mean, the tension between innovation and consistency continues to permeate throughout. Let me hand over to Michelle and see what initial comments she has in response.
Thanks, Steve. And a big thank you, Paul and Alexander, for setting the scene. I think some really interesting reflections. For those who don't know, ActionAid, we are a global women's rights organisation working in 45 countries to end poverty and inequality. And I think for me, perhaps one of the most powerful concepts coming out of the research is really about the critical importance of, a system-wide approach. Particularly given the compounding crises facing many of the communities we're working in. And definitely from a gender equality perspective, we have seen, some of the hard-won gains go backwards by close to a decade. So I think as NGOs, we definitely need to have the humility to recognise we can't solve these grand problems alone. And there's a lot of value and the potential to have greater impact if we do work in partnerships, and that's both within the sector and also with other sectors and bringing in different expertise. And I think, really the big issue there is how do we focus on co-creation and building shared vision as partners together. I guess from ActionAid's perspective, definitely we see a lot of value addition coming from cross-sector partnerships. And this has really been an opportunity, I think, for us to not only increase competency, but definitely look at sort of non-traditional delivery models in our work. And, we specifically see this, like others around the area of technology. As NGOs, we don't have a lot of our own internal capability. And even if we have staff working in digital areas, it really is, how do we keep a pace with so many different opportunities that are out there for the communities we work with. And, as definitely from our strategy perspective, we do see that technology can be an incredible accelerator for change, particularly on gender equality. And we've seen this in Vanuatu with some of our work, particularly trying to support women who have been marginalised around early warning and disaster preparedness, where we've been able to work with DFAT, with Digicel as a private sector partner, the Vanuatu Bureau of Meteorology to train women around interpreting, weather reports, patterns, using technology and getting access to technology. And, now women in Vanuatu, through the Women Talk Together network, are reaching more than half the population with their early warning messages in Bishlama, the local language. And this is not only meeting a sort of an important development need, but it is also really shifting the way women are seen in society and giving them direct access to, information and technology to drive forward change. So I think there is a really strong case for cross-sector partnerships in how we can both respond to the threat of disasters and also amplify impact. I think the big challenge, remains around sustainability of models. And I think that's where it's really interesting also reflecting and hearing from some of Save the Children's experiences. Because definitely, if we, when government and philanthropic funding does move on and shift to other priorities, I think thinking about, the sustainable business model that underpins these kind of impact initiatives is really important. And this is where I think in the report that Alexander shared, I think this idea on how can we repurpose not only resources, but also some of our core assets as organisations and think about, how they can be used in different ways. The potential even for commercialisation of some of those assets, I think is really interesting for us to be thinking about as NGOs. The one thing I did want to put on the table that I think we really need to keep thinking about in our business models and cross-sector partnerships, particularly if we are looking at new markets and bringing in expertise, is how this aligns with a localisation and decolonisation agenda. So that we aren't continuing to promote this, global north to global south transfer of knowledge. And that we are really building on local capability and supporting locally led development, which is critical to sustainable development. So I think that's really the challenge we need to tackle in thinking about the models going forward, and also how, even within sort of looking at impact investing, how we don't, how we do stay focused on the most vulnerable and marginalised. That's not always the easiest to focus on in the area of impact investing, and we definitely don't want to lose a strong line of sight on how we lift everyone up, starting with those who are most vulnerable. Thank you.
Thanks. And Aidan, we'd welcome a perspective from DFAT on this topic. So some initial comments from you, and then we can go to some more Q&A, please.
Yeah, thanks very much, Steve, and also to Paul and Alexander for that great kind of presentation. And let me congratulate, XSPI and Accenture for the report itself. It's, again, a really valuable resource that we've certainly shared with colleagues across the department. I mean, I think maybe a starting point is to reflect that obviously some of the challenges facing sort of sustainable kind of business models for NGOs are sort of longer standing in terms of dependency on particular funding sources, whether it be government grants or the private sector. But obviously, COVID itself has had a really significant impact on many, international and local NGOs. So I sort of saw that firsthand in my experience in Indonesia, where we were overseeing a wide range of civil society partnerships, and many of those local partners, those funding sources were impacted during COVID, where the government and other partners had to redirect funding, and many of those local partners really had to adapt in different ways to kind of survive. So I think sort of an explicit focus on funding sustainability in the actual activities of government NGO partnerships, for example, developing sustainability plans at the outset and thinking through issues around diversification of funding, I think are really important to sort of set things up well at the outset, so you're really sort of clear on those expectations. Also, I think, again, the report and the discussions really touched a lot on the role of kind of business innovation and being able to kind of adapt. And obviously, in today's environment, that's just so critical. And I think Paul also spoke about that in the context of the aid sector more generally. I think from the department's perspective, certainly, the real value around cross-sector partnerships, I think, are just reflect that many of the most sort of wicked problems in international development really do need those multi-sectoral, multidisciplinary sort of approaches to solving them. They're not going to be solved by one country or one partner alone, and being able to kind of share that sort of expertise, the different skills and experience and networks that each partner brings to the table. but also just in recognition that you know, the significance of the sort of development financing gap globally, again, are going to really need those broader resources. I think reflecting on the first two discussions, I'm particularly would agree with Paul's assessment that we need, you know, both obviously new and more funding to meet those, but also thinking about some of the different funding models themselves, including kind of, again, the sort of concern around individual projectized approaches or sort of annual versus much more longer term planning and funding cycles. And I think certainly that government, NGOs and the private sector have a role there. So it's a shared area, and that's something I think we're particularly conscious of in the current sort of partnership with the Australian NGO sector through ANCP. But it also goes to, I think, development finance beyond ODA and the aid program too, and the government sort of also committed to do work around development finance there. I think that adaptation point too, and thinking about how the sector operates, is recognizing, I think, that often we have a traditional sort of sectoral focus in particular areas. And I think, you know, whether that be health, education, gender equality, I think it's about how we adapt and think about the challenges within those areas. And again, I think Paul spoke about the role of EdTech as an emerging area, but also sort of how we move to addressing sort of newer focus areas that we know are a real priority for partner countries. You know, the digital economy is sort of just one example that's, you know, a really big focus at the moment. So I think it really, for the sector, is that challenge of how do you get the blend between that sort of mission focus for the development sector and NGOs with the right skill sets, you know, for those new challenges. Sometimes that's bringing in kind of others too. And I think some of those issues too, obviously I've spoken about from the department's engagement in the development program, but how we think about Australia, how we encourage our investing sector to also, you know, look at the region and the opportunities for things like impact investing beyond kind of, I guess, the safer returns domestically. Thanks.
Thanks, Aidan. Appreciate that. Yeah, adapting. There's a lot there. I guess I want to pick up on this point of, as things get more complex, they're rife for power dynamics to be repeated and diverted away from the impact of the purpose of the organisations. Let me bring Paul in, because you touched on this at the start about the twin focus on business modelling and maintaining a focus on impact. And Alex touched on the power dynamics, and Michelle touched on sort of the balance of focus. How do you respond to some of these things? How do you maintain all of these balls that are in the air and ensure that the purpose of why we exist as NGOs isn't dissipated?
So there's a few things, Steve. So the first one is, you know, we do need to acknowledge that these new forms of funding and these new business models are not going to solve all of our current funding needs. I mean, it's not like that grants and philanthropy is no longer going to be required. In fact, you know, there's really just a subset, and perhaps even a small subset or a minority subset of problems that we're trying to address as a sector that can be financed by these innovative finance models. So that's sort of the first point I would make. The second one is absolutely, perhaps there is more risk when you are starting to engage in new business models and new financing forms that you lose the focus on your mission. And Michelle talked about the most disadvantaged. I think, you know, that's a question of leadership. You've just got to constantly bring it back and essentially have that as your first lens for, you know, is this a good business opportunity? Is this a financial model that we want to explore, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the second thing. The third thing I'd say, Steve, is that actually some of these new financing models can be particularly helpful for, you know, for example, say the children's localization agenda. We are in the process of funding a business called Cumway Hub, which is a really localized social enterprise, you know, local social enterprise organization based out of Kigali in Rwanda, doing some fantastic stuff, encouraging youth or enterprises that tackle youth unemployment in that part of the world. You know, they needed a loan. That's something that, you know, we have been able to facilitate ultimately through some of the donors that Say the Children has access to, that this organisation, as a local organisation, wouldn't have the same access to. So we can facilitate that to actually encourage their fantastic localised response. Now, again, it's not going to be useful for all of our purposes, but if we've got the right mindset and are looking for how we can solve some of our challenges in a different way, innovative finance can be a really useful example. And I'm sure Shane at Good Return has a lot of those sorts of examples where they've been able to support local organisations, local NGOs, attract funding that they wouldn't otherwise be able to do.
Yeah, Shane, I will bring you in on this because you talked about so Paul's raised the issue of laser focus, but a really broad mind to make it happen. And you talked about the fact that NGOs weren't getting in thinking more broadly. How would you suggest to people who are thinking in a certain kind of way to at once open up their thinking to partnering opportunities, but maintain a laser focus?
I completely endorse all the comments about laser focus, and as my team will attest, whenever a new venture comes sort of across my desk, a proposal or a proposition, the first question I ask is, how is this going to benefit people living in poverty? And that's the first question. The second one is, after our intervention, how's that going to be sustained 5 years down the track and 10 or 15 years down the track? And if we can't answer those two questions, I don't even look at the business model or any of the rest of it. So that's the starting point. In terms of how, I do have a lot of conversations with with other nonprofits that are curious about impact investing and other forms of financing, and my response is always the same. There's a whole bunch of different fora and networks, and I mentioned a couple of them earlier, that you need to go along to and just have conversations with the other agencies. The Impact Investment Summit that happens every year, the summit that I mentioned in Indonesia, the Asia Venture Philanthropy Network, the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. There's all these different fora of actors operating in these spaces. So attending those, having conversations, seeing who's out there. But I don't think it's about, it's obviously you can't be all things to all people, and it really is about narrowing down on what is your organizational expertise, what are you good at, and what can you add value, how can you add value to the sector, and really in some ways even narrowing your focus, being really crystal clear. And that way it makes it easier to identify what the collaboration opportunities are. I'll also just add, there's some really good points that Michelle made about localization and also reaching more marginalized people, and I see there was some comments in the chat around that, and how do you actually do that, particularly with impact investment and these sorts of more commercial financing. And I can just give a couple of small examples in terms of localization. So through our impact investment fund, we've partnered with an Indonesian fintech that was financing farmers. So this is Indonesian run, Indonesian owned, but we provided some investment to help them expand. But what they weren't doing is they were reaching 90+% of their clients were male farmers. And so we said to them, we explored market opportunities for them. They operate in the agriculture sector. We looked for agricultural value chains where women could play a role. We found chili was one of those. And so, we subsidized their entry into that chili value chain so that they could support women entrepreneurs. And in their new branches now, more than 30% of their clients are women entrepreneurs from less than 10. And so, I guess that's an example. Also, there was a question about how, I guess, less capable organizations, particularly local civil service organizations, can act in this more sophisticated ecosystem. And another example is, we partner with local organizations for people with disabilities, often very informal local groups. And we engage with them so that they can provide financial education training within their networks to other people with disabilities, and then small business training so they can access these other forms of finance. So there are ways for all manner of different agencies to get involved, as long as they're really laser clear about what their value add is.
No, I appreciate that. Michelle, you got comments on how do you maintain your impact focus and broaden your ability to partner?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I think in this context that I think the power relations are really important. And and going back to Paul's original question, define the problem. I think for me, it's about who defines the problem and how do we make sure that communities that initiatives are focused on serving are really at the forefront of defining that problem. And then, then a range of different actors and stakeholders can come in and help open up and explore some of those opportunities. But I think from our perspective, definitely it's critical that we keep, the communities, any initiative is targeted really on the driving seat of that, because otherwise we will just continue to replicate a certain type of development that we know needs to shift, needs to change. But yeah, so and I think also I think on partnerships, I think let's acknowledge that part of this whole area is really helping to unpack just a range of different options and solutions that, as NGOs, we don't always have the line of sight on. And, and I think that there are, lots of things out there. And I've mentioned technology, but I do think that solutions that are out there that could really enhance impact for communities. And I think then it is really about then how do communities engage in whether those solutions are appropriate, fit for purpose, how they could be adapted to local context. So yeah, I definitely think it is a role of leadership. I think leadership that goes off track from mission is really dangerous. And I think that's why this notion of co-creation and working on shared vision in any kind of partnership is critical. So we don't find ourselves sort of drifting.
No, I appreciate that. And Aidan, I guess I want to ask where DFAT's role is in fomenting partnerships to push NGOs towards thinking differently, particularly when there's the compliance mindset of maintaining government funding has dominated, and the projectized approach that both you and Paul have talked about. Where can DFAT contribute more to shifting the focus within the NGOs and development sector?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think that is a really kind of challenging area. And I do think, just at the outset, DFAT does have a really important kind of convening role in doing that. And certainly my branch with our partnership with both ACFID and, over 60 sort of Australian NGOs through the ACFID program, those sort of partnerships and the work that we do through the funding itself obviously set some of those incentives around that. So, I would just sort of say at the outset, I think we recognise some of the feedback from the sector around, that sort of really dominant focus around compliance and financial management risks and the risks around operating and how you strike that better balance in the policy settings, but for big kind of global programs like the ACP, which really do encourage partners to try things differently, shift to multi-year longer funding timeframes to provide that predictability, including for downstream sort of local partners and how that is. So I do think it also sort of, like others have said, comes back to some of those sort of power dynamics and sort of incentive issues that are sort of inherent in, if you like, funding kind of models. I think there are sort of also opportunities sort of in that too, where you're working on a particular thing. And just to draw back that earlier points around really being laser-like around specific problems and cross-sectoral partnership work. And I think at the moment, the government's made it very clear that climate change is just such a central focus sort of for the government and also for the development program, in terms of that goes to obviously to partnerships around climate finance and how programs kind of contribute to that. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there as well for partners to be able to kind of share expertise there, and also think about how we position both domestically and kind of in the region.
I appreciate that. Look, I'm looking at the time and it's running away from us, as always in interesting conversations like this. Tori, I wonder if you can give me one or two of the questions from the chat box that we can put to the panel as a final comment.
Yeah, definitely. There's been a few around localization, which have been touched on. One from Anthea Spinks around impact measurement. One to the panel, she asks, as we know, much of our work doesn't lend itself to a 1 + 2 = 3 impact measure, but is more intangible, and the models of measuring that impact are also complex and nuanced, especially when looking at system level change. I'd be keen to hear from the panel around how they see or measure the changes we are seeking and how they balance the expectations of the business, funding models, investors around that.
All right, I'm going to give you one and a half minutes each. I'm going to start with Paul, then Michelle, and then probably Aidan to finish it. Oh, okay.
One, Steve, I always think that you can find measures, proxy measures. Sometimes you've just got to be, you work a little bit harder on finding the right measures that don't create the wrong disincentives, those sorts of things. I think second issue, just to address that point, is goes back to really the laser focus on mission. And, you're right, alternative funding mechanisms, impact investors might take you off mission. We have been really focused around making sure that any investor we brought in bought into the sort of investment hypothesis that was associated and closely aligned with Save Children's mission. So being really clear that your partnership goals are aligned is pretty critical as well. So maybe those two things. I'll let others comment.
Sure, Michelle.
Yes, I think we definitely need to evolve our systems level evaluation processes. But, I think we have to start by going back to, looking at actually the inherent thing. And I go back to what Paul said about what's the problem we're trying to solve. So for any evaluation we do, we're always looking at, how has women's empowerment shifted, and what has been our contribution to that change and others in the system. So where were there, where has that been enabled by partnerships? So I think if we stay very focused on mission, I think that is a critical way that we can deepen evaluation. And I think the other thing I would say is, we're a very strong advocate for participatory evaluation methods, and because I think it is critical that communities are really defining the impact from their perspective, and this is the danger where evaluation is led much more by a donor or an outside agency. So how has that fundamentally changed for the communities it was meant to serve? I mean, I think they would be some of the things I would start with.
Yeah, great. And Aidan, final comment.
I definitely think it's a great question from Anthea around that, and we can certainly I think a trap often is for government obviously being able to speak to really specific outputs or project things without being able to tell that bigger story of what we're actually trying to do. So I think the 2 points that I'd make, I think, is when we think about those proxy measures, things like the leverage aspect, just being able to tell a story about how, again, a smaller investment led to a much larger one. And again, it is probably an important kind of cultural change where we can actually better tell a story about system level change rather than those incentives around, more practical things like kids in school or immunisation targets. So I think that narrative and being able to tell that story is really important. And that does come back to kind of having realistic and easily explainable kind of outcomes that you're trying to achieve. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, making sure that the way that we do the business doesn't drive the business of what we do. There's something around that. There's something about maintaining leadership connection on the purpose of why we exist, and then enabling all the pieces to come together. Please join me in thanking Shane, Michelle, Aidan, Paul, and Alex. Thank you for your time, much appreciated. And I'm going to hand over to Dan to finish us up.
You're on mute, Dan.
Okay, apologies. Quick wrap up. On behalf of the webinar series steering committee, I'd like to express our appreciation specifically to Steve Goudswaard for his moderator role. Also, as all those speakers and panelists today. Firstly, to Paul Ronalds for his very insightful and convincing case for change with Steve in the engaging Fireside chat. Next to Alex for taking us through some of the key learnings from the very informative and well-executed Accenture research project. Strong note of appreciation, as Steve's already done, to our panelists. Again, well moderated by Steve, thank you. I'm sure everyone agrees with my observation that we all benefited greatly from their collective experience and wisdom, which provides a strong platform for our planned second webinar. My final acknowledgement goes to those who did the key organizing of this event, including ACFID's Shweta Tank, Accenture's Tori Stuckey, David Schwer, and Alex Schmidt, and our XSPI Research Associate, Jasmine Stevens. The Accenture Research Report and the webinar recording will be available on the ACFID, CID, and XSPI websites or related LinkedIn access. So we're pleased about that. Going forward, we're very keen to keep the conversation alive. So we're encouraging all of you to forward any questions or feedback via the XSPI LinkedIn. And when you do that, we specifically request that you provide feedback or comments targeted to Paul or Alex or Steve related to the Fireside chat, the research, or the panel, and then we'll forward them and try to facilitate your getting a response. Finally, on behalf of ACFID, AIDN, Accenture, CID, and XSPI, our sincere appreciation to all the participants today. I was clocking, I think probably cumulatively there were 130 or more who attended, which we would feel is a very strong number. So thank you for your time and interest attending. And we look forward to reconvening about the 13th to the 15th of September for our second webinar. Bye now.